Okay.
Shabbat Shalom and welcome, Rabbi Cohen. Welcome to everybody. Thank you for being here today.
It's great to see everybody here. Good morning, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi.
Good morning. So I'm Rabbi Cohen. I have been in Denver for almost 30 years now. Um, as I was saying to Sherry, I started in 95 as an assistant rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in Denver here. Then I was the solo rabbi at Temple Micah for several years. And then I had some health challenges that led me to no longer being a congregational rabbi. But what I do currently is I do a lot of writing and speaking around mental health issues in the Jewish and other religious communities. I know that Sherry sent out links to my website. If you're ever bored and you want something, I got stuff there you can read or not. And I love to teach text. I love to just sit down with people and look at a piece of Torah and talk about it together. I like to bring in commentaries and thoughts, but mostly I want to hear what you all have to say, right? Because this is our tradition. It belongs to us, and we get to decide how we interpret it today, right? Rashi decides how it was interpreted in the 11th century, and we're in the 21st century. So, we have moving right along. So today is Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan. It's the beginning of the month of Cheshvan. Cheshvan is traditionally or often called Mar Cheshvan, which means bitter Cheshvan, because Cheshvan has no holidays in it. But after Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, and Simchat Torah, I have a t-shirt that says Rabbis love Cheshvan because we are just so tired. One of the things I learned this year that I hadn't thought about before, but so I'll put it out there for you. So Sukkot is a holiday of rejoicing, right? It's the harvest festival. We brought in our crop. We know we have enough to eat. We're all very happy about it. But in biblical times, at least, right? Cheshvan, Sukkot was the last holiday that they had until we get to Passover in the spring, right? Tu B'Shvat, right? In the spring, Tu B'Shvat is a Kabbalistic idea. I mean, it's a rabbinic idea in terms of agriculture, but the whole idea of a Tu B'Shvat Seder, that's Kabbalists, 15th, 16th, 17th century. Hanukkah is post-biblical, right? So they've already shut the Tanakh, right? So they were like, oh, we got nothing for 6 months, which might be good. And so, and as you know, we begin the Torah cycle again last week on Parshat Bereshit, the parsha of the first parsha of the Torah, where we get created in Adam and Eve and all of those stories. And then this week is the second parsha, which is Noah. And these very early stories, especially like the creation narrative and the flood narrative and the Tower of Babel narrative, one of the things that they are kind of just so stories, right? They are stories of how did we get to where we are, right? How did the world get created? How, or really more importantly, why were people created? How did we end up in our situation? How does God relate to the world? And the Tower of Babel narrative, which is a short story, so we'll see how long we spend on it, comes at the end of Parshat Noach. I think it's a great story. I also think that, so let's see, so 28 years ago or something, when I was, or whatever, 27 and a half years ago, when I got placed on bed rest before the birth of my child, you have to just lie all the time. Oh my goodness, right? So we did a few things. We got cable. I said to my husband, I can't just lie on the sofa all day and watch Jerry Springer. I can't do it. So we did that. And I had this huge latch hook Noah's Ark project that I made for my child. Hung it up in her room, still there. And she has remarked to me, Mama, she says, Noah's Ark is a very strange story that we tell to children, right? Oh, it's fun with the 2x2 of the animals, but oh my goodness, it's a scary story, right? God says, oh, I'm unhappy, I'm going to wipe out the world. Like, that is not a toddler story. That is a distressing one. But it's not the one we're about to do. So we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel. I haven't said my blessing for Torah study yet today. It is la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we're going to bless Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, God, who commands us to engage in the story of the study of Torah. So here we go. The Tower of Babel, those of you following along at home, this is Genesis 11. So it begins, right? We have everybody's settled down. They've done this and that. Chapter 11 begins, Vayihi kol haaretz sava achat u'devarim achedim. So everyone on earth had the same language, or literally tongue, which makes sense, right? And the same words. So what does that mean, and why do we need both of them? So Rashi says, look, the same language, the same tongue refers to the holy tongue, which would be Hebrew, right? The idea that in the beginning, everyone spoke Hebrew, because that's the Lashon Kodesh. That's the holy tongue. But he goes on and says the same words. The same words means they had the same plans. They were all of like one mind. What were they going to do? Well, they got together. They said, this shouldn't be entirely God's decision to keep the upper worlds for God's self. Let's go up on the firmament and wage war on God. You could see why that would be a problematic thing. Right? Also unclear on how that works. Like, how would you wage war on God? Not as though God has a body, right? Not as though God is someone you can take your sword and stick him through, or take a brick and hit him with, right? It's right. But the idea, however, right, it's biblical. That's sort of, there's the earth, the sky, and then there's the firmament. And the firmament separates the heavens from the earth. If you read the Noah story, they talk, some parts of the Noah story, it says it rained. Parts of it talks about the firmament reopening. Parts of the Noah story essentially says, look, in the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth, and God creates this firmament between the heaven and earth. And the flood is an experience of uncreation, decreation, as it were. God created a firmament to separate heavens from earth. God opens the firmament and lets the water pour out. Any case. And then the other thing that Rashi says is, he says, the people of the time of the Tower of Babel thought that once every 1,656 years, the sky would wobble as it had during the flood. And so let us now support it so it won't fall down on us again. Right? They're a little scared. Noah has been God promises Noah never to do that again, but in some ways you just can't be too certain. Yeah, thoughts? Speak up, or I'm just going to read at you and it's going to be very boring. What does it mean for everybody to think the same way? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Rabbi Cohen, from my understanding of the Hebrew language, devar does not only mean word. Devar can also, depending on the context, mean a thing, like a physical object.
Yeah, thing. Do you want to say more about that? What does that do to our verse if it means they had the same stuff or the things? Oh. And I'm thinking partly because, right, we're on the eve, or many of you may have voted already. Many of you may be voting soon. Everybody should vote, go for it. But this is like a picture of a time before people thought differently from one another. Right? Everybody, it's like everybody thinks exactly the same way.
Can't believe that ever happened.
But I've often thought that this was a mistake, if you will, in the sense that before the Tower of Babel, people didn't think they were different. In other words, they all were together. Whereas once you separate them by language, they go their different ways, and then you have all kinds of animosities that develop and conflicts that develop. I've always thought that this was kind of a mistake.
Oh, the having people scattered with various languages.
Yes.
Right. And it's the story and the kind of shot, the plain meaning of the text seems to be saying, yeah, this was a punishment, right? But there's an undercurrent in some of the rabbinic explanations that sort of are saying the opposite, which is to say that kind of say, look, when everybody thinks the same way, uses the same words, the problem, the other side of that, yes, when we think differently, we have animosity and wars and terrible, terrible things. On the other hand, we also have a variety of points of view, and which might be a good thing, right? So one of the fundamental differences between me and God, right, is that I'm not always right. Don't tell my husband, but I'm not, in fact, always right, right? I don't know everything. We like to think, right? My politics is right. My way of seeing the world is right. My way of reading a text is right. But there's a undercurrent in the rabbinic commentators that essentially say that no, that the Torah already speaks with 70 languages, 70 tongues. And in the rabbinic literature, in the Torah literature too, 70 means just a whole lot. 70 is a lot.
There's a question.
Yeah.
Richard?
Yeah, thank you. Now, this occurred after the flood.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, then we have to assume that before the flood, everyone spoke the same language.
And we got in trouble anyway.
And yes, and perhaps God viewed this as contributing to the world of sin that existed around Noah. Because, if everyone was speaking the same language, they were following the same culture, and it was a culture of evil. And so the destruction of, not to say the destruction of the tower, because it's not, he doesn't destroy the tower, he just makes it so that people can't work together. Maybe that was, God said, this caused trouble before Noah, it's going to cause trouble after Noah. So the answer is, let's at least make all people separate, and then you can have, some will pursue an evil way, but others will be good, and that'll allow for this variety to exist.
Absolutely. I think exactly. Like it's like God says, okay, because that's essentially what God says. Noah comes out of the ark. He offers up a sacrifice. God says, okay, people are just like that. They're going to be like this, right? They're going to make trouble. And sure enough, the next major story we have is the story of us making trouble. I'm sorry, John?
Are you calling me?
Yeah.
John.
I'm a little confused and simple-minded. I think that the story is maybe the second half of this, after they start building the tower, and I think one speech or maybe one mind that's possible. That's even in my edition, but it's how they propose to reach the heavens again. I don't know if they were all Republicans and Democrats or what. or, and, you know, I thought God had eliminated sin, with the flood. So
Yeah,
there's a lot going on in, say, versus, I don't know, or forward.
absolutely.
Please continue.
No, I was gonna say, but it's absolutely true, right? God gave us, certainly in the biblical and rabbinic mind, unlike animals, we have free will. And if we have free will, we're gonna sometimes make bad choices, right? And here we are doing that. Okay, right? So what happens? Okay, verse 2 goes to say, just by the way, right? As they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. And Rashi says essentially, look, there were a lot of them, and they had to find a way someplace that was big enough to hold them all. Right? Ibn Ezra tells us that they'd been looking for a good spot for a metropolis. Yeah, it's its own wonderful interest, right? Like, aren't you glad, for example, that you didn't have to come to Denver or Albuquerque or wherever in the covered wagon with some horses, and right? Migrating is not an easy thing, and yet we see them already doing that, right? That's kind of its own theme in the background of starting one place and moving. And so they said to each other, verse 3, Vayomu ish el re'ehu, they said one to one another, right? To everybody, to their fellow, they said, come, let us make bricks and burn them hard. Bricks served them as stone and bitumen as mortar. Right? So, and yeah, and right. So bricks and bitumen and all of that should sound familiar to us later, right? Because we read about that in Exodus as well, right? That they had to make the bricks to build the stuff for Pharaoh in Egypt. So here they're doing this. Let me see here. So in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, it says, Rabbi Pinchas said, there were no stones there with which to build the city and the tower. What did they do? They baked bricks and burnt them like a builder would do until they built it 7 mills high and had ascents on the east and west, right? So they're thinking about the size of the stone. I was just privileged enough for my husband to be in Europe and looking at old cathedrals that are made of these massive, right, stones. You don't even know how they got them there. So that goes on to say, the laborers who took up the bricks went up on the eastern ascent. So if somebody on the east side of the tower came up with the bricks, and people coming back down to get more stuff would be on the west side. If a man fell and died, they paid no heed. But if a brick fell down, they sat where they were and they wept, saying, Oy lanu, woe is us. When will another one come in its stead? So this interpretation says, look, one of the fundamental problems of the building of the Tower of Babel was misplaced priorities. That bricks were more important than human life. That we get so caught up in what we're making out there that we trample people. And I think that that's an ongoing helpful commentary for me in the background in my life, right? What should I be paying attention to at this moment? The brick or the person who just fell down? Clearly the rabbis have an answer for that, right? It's not okay, right? You need to remember that, sometimes we end up then stepping on other people.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
You are muted. You're muted.
just a comment. That same theme came up at the dedication of Temple Aaron many
Uh-huh.
years ago. And by the way, there are 118,000 bricks in Temple Aaron. And
Excellent.
at the dedication, Rabbi Freudenthal made the point that this is a wonderful edifice, but it's really about the people who populate it and attend it and support it and help it grow in the community. That's the real message
It absolutely.
beyond the edifice.
Yeah, you know, when I was in rabbi school, they would sometimes talk about when we were doing kind of more pastoral learning, how are you going to go do that sort of things. And people would talk about that it's really easy to get sucked into the edifice complex, right? Which is just that, building more people, building whatever, instead of paying attention to the person in front of you, right? It's not the bricks that make up Temple of Aaron, right? It's the people who on an ongoing basis cared about it and continue to care about it, right? Otherwise, it's just a building. I mean, it's a beautiful building, but it's a building. It becomes meaningful when we have the stories of people, right? The history of it. Then it becomes alive.
I think so.
Yeah. All right, so they said, let's make bricks. So we made bricks. Everybody says, yay, bricks. And then here's where you go. It says in verse 4, it says, Vayomru hava nivneh lanu ir umigdal v'rosho b'shamayim v'naseh lanu shem. Pain nafutz al panei kol haaretz. So this is for those of you who like kind of classical, like Greek mythology and that sort of thing. Right here, you have the punishment is already described in the intention, right? What do they say? They said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens to make a name for ourselves, lest we shall be scattered all over the world, right? So we read that and think, oh my goodness, that's what's about to happen, right? Like the very thing that they're afraid of is what they're going to get punished, is what's going to be their punishment for doing this. Sort of like, well, you know, you might fear that, but yeah, that's not the major issue at hand here, right? Right? They wanted Rashi tells us they want a city to live in and a tower so they could keep an eye on livestock in the far distance. It would also serve as a signal to the shepherds who were coming back to where to drive their flocks to, right? So they could find their way back to the city. So nice. And he's very kind. He says when it says that's top in the heavens, he just means very tall. And then he comes on and said, we want to all have the same Shem, the same name, right? Remembering, even if we go far away, that we belong to this city and we'll return to it. Otherwise, people will move away, that will settle hither and yon, and our society will be scattered to the four winds. So some of you may have children and grandchildren who have chosen to scatter themselves to the four winds, right? They have, in fact, moved away. And we at home think, why don't they want to live nearby so I can see them? And yet we also know that it's part of it's the natural process of things, right? Even if your kid is still in town by the time, you know, they're a certain age, we hope that they leave the house, you know, and create their own family, their own community, their own, all of that, right? Every generation does a little bit more or moves out a little bit more. Right. So Rashbam, who is Rashi's grandson, well, he's his grandson-in-law, but he says, Rashbam says, according to the straightforward meaning of the text, what is the sin of the generation of dispersion? And I'll come back to you, John, in just a second. If it was the tower with its top in the heavens, we read elsewhere that there's cities with very tall buildings. Rather, it's that the Holy One commanded people to be fertile and increase and fill the earth back in chapter 1 of the Bible. But they chose to settle in the same place instead, so they wouldn't be scattered. And so, right, so God, it's not so much that, it's sort of like God saying, look, go fill the earth. And they're like, no, we're all just going to live right here. We're not going to go check out the earth. Yeah, John, what were you going to say?
Haven't thought this through to the end, but we are in the diaspora, and like 50 years ago, we were in 150 countries, and it wasn't great. Now we're mostly in the U.S. and Israel and a couple of other countries, and we're not welcome all over the world.
This is absolutely true, right? You go to Europe and you find remnants of Jewish community all over the place. It's also true, however, that the commandment, like to fill the earth, and this story also, these are all pre-Jewish, right? Abraham comes next week. So it's not just Jews that were supposed to fill the earth, it's all peoples. That's its own interesting issue, right? We find places where we belong, and then other people migrate to us, and we have to kind of figure out where do we all fit. Because it's not so simple. So, here we are. Once they learned how to bake bricks, Barbanel says, once they figured out making the bricks, they wanted to build something with them. Which reminds you very much, right, of like 5-year-olds who are first figuring out Legos. They're like, oh, cool. Look what I can make. Some kids more than others, right? Depends on the way your brain works. Right? So there's this image, though, just by the way, there's an image in a lot of the commentary that seem to think that there are other people out there than we're just here. It's the same issue we have with Noah, right? You're like, or if you go back to like Adam, Eve, and Cain and Abel, you're like, where did these other people come from? Right? Adam and Eve had 3 kids. One of them died, right? Then Cain and Shem survived, but this indication that there are these other peoples out there that we don't really know where they come from, which gives us more of a sense too that this is a story. These are sort of mythical beginning stories whose reality doesn't necessarily fit in well with history, but fits in well with why we are the way we are, as opposed to the actual explanation of where we came from. It's more like, oh, look, there are all these peoples or all these languages. I wonder how that happened. Well, and what else about Babel, by the way? Babel becomes Babylonia, right? Becomes the place, right? Babylonia is the place where we are exiled to, and where there are not the first, but Babylonia has one of the strongest diaspora Jewish communities in the rabbinic era, right?
Right. Yeah,
the Jews in Babylonia, they're the Jews in the land of Israel. And people going back and forth, which again is amazing. So the Tower of Babel works partly as saying, this is the bad space.
If there's no diaspora, if people aren't scattered all over, they can get wiped out very easily, as Hitler tried to do. If you're all in one place at one time, very easy to be eliminated.
Absolutely, because look, what did the first thing Hitler did was to make sure that Jews moved back into the ghetto, right? Because from everybody being in a smaller spot, it was much easier to kill them that way. It was much more efficient. So yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but yeah, there's a certain strength in being all over the place. So here they are, they're building their tower, and I know we all want to know how it turns out. So verse 5 says, Vayered Hashem lirot et ha'ir v'et hamigdal asher banu v'nei ha'adam. Hashem, God comes down to look at the city and tower that man, that right, people literally had built. So this is just, by the way, couple of things. One is, so most of us know that when you move to Israel, it's called making aliyah, right? To go up. The other side of that is when you move to the diaspora or to the exile, depending on how you want to refer to it, it's called yeridah, going down, right? Going up to the land of Israel, going down. So here you have God coming down. Why would God, Rashi's like, why would God need to do that? The text says, when it says God came down, as it were, it simply means God started looking at what people were doing, right? Right? And you have the same language, very similar language of God going down to see in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so it's an image of God saying, okay, I've been busy with heavenly matters, but now I'm going to go and check out what's happening on earth. As though somehow God didn't know for a while, right? It's a very anthropomorphic version of God who can't pay attention to everything all at once, much like we can't, right? And you can, and this is true, by the way, similar language with the flood. God says, God sees how corrupt the earth has become, right? So, but Rashi's like, but come down to look is a metaphor. It's a metaphor. Right? And they are, so there are lots of ways of referring to people. But in this case, they're called B'nai Adam, children of Adam. And Rashi says, yep, they are absolutely the children of Adam because they're just like Adam and Eve in the garden. They're following their own desires and not what God wants them to do, right? It's wonderful. I love that image. They're like, okay, you know, we're out here, we got free will, cool. What are we going to do with our free will? And, you know, over and over again, we as human beings mess up. Okay? That's like the nature of being a person. We mess up. We rely on others for help. All of these sorts of things. I'm trying to see what I want to say, right? And Bechor Shor says the same way. The text is obviously talking in human terms. He says, Hashem can look down and investigate perfectly well from wherever God is, right? It's more like, so like they're very clear. This is an idiom. It's an idiom. It's an idiom. We're like, okay, then it's an idiom. Fine. God's coming down to check out. And what happens is it's Vayomer Hashem, Hein, Am Echad, Sfa Achat Lekula, V'zeh Hakilam La'asot, Ba'ata Lo Yibatzer Mehem, Kol Asher Yizmud La'asot. And God says, if as one people, right, Am Echad, with one language for all, this is how they've begun to act, nothing they want to do is going to be beyond them. Nothing, right? They will be able to do whatever they want. And it's an interesting thing for God to say because it makes it sound like God is frightened of people, right? It's a very, again, almost anthropomorphized version of God. God is worried that they can do whatever, and even, right? What they have begun. So literally, that means what they have begun to do. Is the beginning, or the start of something. But it's also true if you want to play with the words, the shorish, the root of the word a little bit. The root of you can also use chet lamed mem as the root of the word, and it would then begin. It doesn't just mean to begin, it would mean to make war. This is the war they have started. Right? If this is the kind of thing that, they're going to make war on heaven, we're not having that. You know, say, everybody calm down and go to your room kind of moment for God. This is what they're doing with their power. This is not what I want them to do with their power. It's just not going to be good. So what then happens, and this is once again, you have sort of the plural God, right? God speaks of God's self in the plural. So we just got to let them do that, right? So Hava nerda v'nivla sham safatam asher lo yishma'u ish safat re'ehu. Let us then, and so clearly the question is who's us here? Who are you talking about? Because let us then go down and confound their speech so that not understand one another's speech. Rashi explains, Rashi says, we can see that out of excessive modesty, God consults with the tzivaot, with God's courts, with the angels, with God's the hosts, right? We talk about Hashem, right? Adonai tzivaot is a language we get of God, the God of hosts. And this doesn't mean host as in come over to my house for Shabbos dinner, although you're welcome to. This is host as in like almost military points of view, right? All of God's servants, angels and cherubim and all these other heavenly things that God consults with, right? God consults with them. When God does the creation story, God's consulting with them again. He says, why don't we figure out what we're going to do together? Let's go down. Right? And then you get the language is lovely. He says that in verse 4, the people say, Hava, let us. And then God says, Hava, come, let us, right? It's a midah keneged midah. It's a measure for measure. They said, come, let's do this. And God says, come, let's stop them from doing that. It's sort of how do you like it when your sibling blah, blah, blah. If you don't like it when he hits you, do you? Then don't hit him. I only have one child, so I only kind of know about that. And Rashi then says that so that they will not understand one another, and he explains very nicely. One will ask for a brick, the other will bring mud, and the first one knocks the second one's brains out. And I love that because that's exactly what it says in Rashi in the Hebrew, right? The second one will go bam on the first one's head, right? Because they're so frustrated. Right? And language is such a huge, right? Language is what allows us to make peace with each other in many ways. It's how we communicate. We so often in our family and friends' life, in our political life, in our communal life, so often we can talk right past one another, right? You are saying something and I'm not even listening. I'm already thinking what I'm going to say. So we might all be speaking English, but we can be not really listening to each other. Just so many ways. My husband is among many things a musician, and so he's got this great ear for language. So we were in Europe. He actually speaks some French, so he had enough French to like speak to people in French, not really enough to get the whole answer, right? Like when you know just enough to say where's the bathroom, but you can't understand the answer in that other language, right? That's its own issue. And then German, he could say, even though he couldn't understand. Czech, he didn't get it all. But on our flight home on Lufthansa Airlines, they would do the announcement first in German and then in English. And we're both really tired, right? Whatever, on the flight home. And he's on one side of me mimicking the German words and with great glee. And on the other side of me is a nice German man who's kind of looking at him. And it's like, then they think you're making fun of them. It's like, no, the language is just so beautiful. But right, even when we have the same language, we might not have the same language. Talking to each other is a hard thing. Okay, so but what it says, Ibn Ezra says, God says to the angels, if they're acting as one people, and that is to say with a single religion, he says differences in religion can produce zealotry and hatred, as do differences in language, which is why the kings of Persia and Media commanded in the book of Esther, every person should speak the language of their own person, of their own people. But right, so when we think about terrible things that have happened in the world, it's often set up as one people against another people, whether you have the Christians in the Crusades and killing everybody who wasn't, Christian, or you have Hitler singling out Jews and the Roma people and homosexuals because they are they, right? Whether you have what's happening in the Middle East right now, right? Religion can be a force for terrible differences and persecution. And religion can also inspire us to behave in good ways, right? It's how we use it. Because you don't need to be religious to do terrible things, right? Stalin wasn't a religious guy, right? He managed to wipe out lots of people, right? So you don't, but the zealotry and the idea that I am right and I am in the in group and you're in the out group, that creates tragedy for people. What we begin to do to each other. If you are all you're they, then I don't have to care about you anymore because I'm us and you're they, and I don't have to care about you. Whereas if we sit down face to face and I say, here's my story, and you say, oh, here's my story. Interesting how we saw the same event in very different terms. And instead of saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, we can say, look at that. There are multiple ways of seeing the world. There are multiple ways of being in the world. And it doesn't mean somebody else is bad for not being like me. It means that there are many ways of being in the world. I spent several years, I was blessed several years to sit as the chair of Seeking Common Ground, which was an organization Melody Feldman did here in Denver. And she would bring in teenage Israeli girls, teenage Palestinian girls, and teenage Denver girls. And they would look at a 2 or 3 week program, and they would spend some time up at camp, and they would learn how to listen to each other. Right? They would learn how to say, oh, look at your narrative of the same event, right? An Israeli girl might have called it the creation day for the state of, right, for the state of Israel independence. And a Palestinian girl might call it a Nakba, the catastrophe. And they learned how to sit with that and go, the same event and the way we frame it and the way we see it and the way it affected us are very different. And you are not wrong for seeing it differently. It's just, right? Everybody's different. It's the blessing of being a person. We get to have the stories we tell ourselves, and we want to be open to the stories other people are telling as well. So God says, okay, here's what we're going to do, right? Okay, and so what happens? God says, Vayafat Hashem otam misham al pnei kol haaretz vayakdalu libnot ha'ir. So in this way, God scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city, right? Which makes sense. They can no longer understand each other. It's very hard to work on construction projects when you can't, whatever. But it's also God's way of saying, go do stuff that's productive. Why are you building these tall tower when instead you should be having families? Right? Why are you so caught up with bricks and mortar and not enough concerned with being a person? So he says, God says, okay, you guys go, everybody go. Right? So what do I want to say there? It's a good question, right? Or what do you want to say then? What? Right? Ibn Ezra notes this means that they were unable to complete it. Right? John, you going to say something?
Yeah, I never paid attention to this part before. When God scattered everybody, did he scatter different tribes in different countries? Was it all across the globe? Was it very far? I guess they just had one tribe near Babel and one tribe in Turkey,
Yeah.
and one in Palestine. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting, right? God's like, go, 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 right? Everybody away.
Did they just get picked up
and right, that's what you do wonder. Like, what did they do? Did they like take their camels and go?
Yeah.
Kind of imagery. It's right. How far do they have to? Some went further than others. Right? I guess some went further than others, right?
But it seems like this scattering over the earth is virtually the same as 1032, which talks about the fact that after the flood,
Right.
all the nations branched out over the earth. Sounds like it's
Right, and so
almost identical.
Right, and yet the story, right, at the end of the flood, just what you said, right? It's because it gives us lots of Noah's children or descendants. That's the word I was looking for. And then it says, these are the groupings of Noah's descendants according to their origins by their nations. And from these nations branched out over the earth after the flood. And yet the next line in the Torah says, well, they didn't really scatter yet. Like, you're jumping ahead there. Because before they got really scattered, they built the tower. Right? When they build the tower and they say they're afraid that they're just afraid of that, right? God says, go be scattered. They build the tower and say, right, in verse 4, that we don't want to be scattered all over the earth. And yet, right, it's like, I want to say, Chuck's point is good, which is that they didn't get it the first time that they were supposed to scatter all over the earth. And so why this time is it such a problem? Which is a good question, by the way. Like, why don't they want to be scattered? They want to kind of huddle together. God's like, nope, nope. Rashi quotes Proverbs for us and says, what the wicked man plots overtakes him, right? Again, going back to that idea of just that they were afraid of is what happens to them, right? If why worry, right? Just what you might want could be exactly what happens. That's a problem. This is kind of an interesting piece, by the way. So here, Abarbanel says, Babylon itself was certainly destroyed, just like Sodom and Gomorrah will be destroyed in the future, but the valley of Shinar itself is still thickly settled. Indeed, he says, population pressure would have forced them to spread out eventually, right? Just as they had come from Ararat, right? The more people you have, the more space you need. The city gets bigger. Right? But their sin was punished by the expulsion, just like Adam was, right? Adam and Eve left the garden, and Cain had to go further yet after he kills his brother. The sin of them all was to abandon nature and seek material things through artificial means. Now, I'm not sure you can argue that the sin is the same, but it's an interesting idea of things over the world God has already created for us. What do you need a tower for? You've got all this land. All right. And then Ecclesiastes, which we just read, says, God made people plain, but they have engaged in too much scheming. So God's like, look, it's easy. Go do this. And we make it difficult every single time. The nature in some ways of humanity is to make it more difficult, right? The older we get, right? They say little children, little problems, big kids, bigger problems. Right? The more mature we theoretically are, the bigger are the consequences of our behaviors as we go out and become adults in the world. Years and years ago now, I think my nibbling Sam was getting yelled at for doing something, my sister's kid. And he's like, now you have to behave. And his younger brother, Isaac, perks up and says, I'm being behaved, which you never really thought the language for, right? To behave, right? But every time God says, okay, we're going to give you another chance, try and do it right, we make trouble over and over, right? And eventually the Jews do it, right? We are a stiff-necked people. We make trouble every chance we get. It's in our nature. And like one of the things that Yom Kippur is for, is to step back and say, oh, look how I behave. Maybe that's not good. Maybe I should pay attention to the things I ignore. So let's get the rest of the story at the end. And then he says, Al Kain Kara Shema Babel, Kisham Balal Hashem Safat Kol Haaretz Misham Hatitzam Hashem Et Pnei Kol Haaretz. This is why it is called Babel, because this is the place where God confounded the speech of the whole earth. He created all these multiple languages, and from there, God scattered them over the face of the earth. Okay? So Rashi says, look, it says scattered twice, in verse 10 and then in verse 8 and then in verse 9. And Rashi says, in verse 8, we learned that the people were scattered in this world. We learn in this verse 9 that they also may have endangered their place in the world to come. Which sin was worse, the sin of the Tower of Babel or the sin of the generation of the flood? The latter of the generation of the flood, didn't raise a hand against God, while these here were, as it were, making war on God, to fight against God. But the flood generation was wiped off the face of the earth, and these people did not perish. Why? And Rashi tells you the answer. He says the flood generation perished because they were thieves and quarreled with each other, but the generation of the dispersion of the galut here were friendly and loving to each other. They had the same language and the same words. We learn here that quarreling is hateful and peace is great. So in the generation of the flood, they were bad to one another and God wipes them out. Here they are making war on God, and God says, just stop it. Go do something else. And so we get a sense of the idea that in many ways, God holds us almost more responsible for sins between one person and another, the way we treat each other, than for sins we might commit against God. Okay? If you've got a choice of welcoming a stranger into your house versus making sure everything that stranger eats is kosher, God's going to tell you to welcome the stranger every time. Right? Look, God says, look, right? How you behave towards me, not a big deal. You come in, you're sorry on Yom Kippur, you say, I'm going to try again. You have to mean it. You're good to go, right? But for sins between one person and another, we have to ask forgiveness from each other before God will forgive those. That the way we treat each other is so powerful and important and and huge. Okay. I do want to share with you, Ibn Ezra goes on at some length about this. So he says Babel is a compound of the words ba and bel, meaning confusion came. As the written form of the word bagad, where talks about, so this is the idea of that. This is how, right? And Babel, we still think of that, right? Toddlers babble before they speak, right? They make sounds, right? When you hear lots of people talking all at once, people are just babbling to each other and we can't understand it. That Babel becomes a symbol of the idea of not understanding, of not being able to understand one another. All right. So, and Abarbanel says that Babel remained a place of great negativity. The Judeans who were exiled there, right, after when the Babylonians come in 587 and they destroy the temple in Jerusalem and they scatter the Jews into Babel, right? They were exiled there. He says, Abarbanel says, in just 50 years, they forgot their own language. While here in the West, he says, we have not forgotten Hebrew despite this 2,000-year exile, or at this point, 3,000-year exile. He says, look, Babel is a place where you lose your language. You lose, and not just Hebrew. You lose your own stories. You lose your tribe's stories. You lose your family heritage. So there's a tradition in some communities or among some people of as you age of making a will for your children, of an ethical will. There you go. That's the word, right? Of writing down for your children, if you have children, grandchildren, if you have them, great-grandchildren, if you're really lucky, writing down who you are and where you came from. And here is the story of your life. And here are the values that are important to me that I hope that I have passed on to you. So it's not just about speaking or understanding Hebrew. It's about speaking and understanding the stories of our families and the stories of our communities, which takes us all the way back to what Kim said, which is that the Temple of Aaron, right, in Trinidad, the temple is not just the builder. It's the people who created the community and have continued to nurture it so that it's still there. Yeah.
Yeah. Who's the source for that? Is that you, or is that?
That was Abarbanel. Abarbanel says that about the language, which and it's interesting because one of the things that the rabbinic commentaries will tell you about the children of Israel in the land of Egypt is that we continued to use our own names and use our own language, right? And part of the reason God redeemed us is that from Egypt is that we continued essentially to speak the story of the Jewish people. Like they didn't forget their identity, and so then God could redeem them as a people. If you were so assimilated in Egypt that it wasn't clear to you if you were one of the Hebrews or one of the Egyptians, then you may not have left with the Hebrews, although a bunch of people did live with them, right? There's a whole kind of ragtag group at the end of as the Hebrews are leaving, an Erev Rav, a mixed multitude follows and goes with them and gets redeemed also, which is nice. The idea, right, that already present, that it's not just one people that get redeemed, we can all get redeemed. If you think about the Seder with the wise child and the wicked child and the simple child and the one who does not know how to ask, in our generation, we hope that everyone gets redeemed, even the wicked, right? And we get redeemed exactly through our relationships, not just with God, but really our relationships with the other people who are near and dear to us. And also with people who we know nothing about, but are human beings living out a life in the world. And I think that that's one of the things this story comes to teach us is people got scattered all over the place, but it doesn't mean that you should forget that they too are human, no matter how much you disagree with them. And we have to start from there. So there you have it, the Tower of Babel. For those of you really interested, you can learn Hebrew, right? I think there's a babel.com or something that'll teach you languages. So you can still do that, right? The imagery is still powerful. And next week, we begin the story of the Jewish people with Avram and Sarai leaving from the place that leaving and moving on. And so sort of what I will say is these early stories in the Torah keep having people move out and fill the earth and multiply, because these are the very beginning stories where there weren't as many people. They didn't fill as much of the earth. All right.
Tim, were you going to say something?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, Rabbi, when we were in New Mexico at the conference last week for the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society, someone commented on, which I thought was a really interesting take on the meaning of the diaspora that was very specific to New Mexico. They said that New Mexico's Jewish community is a diaspora within the diaspora. They're not only spread far and wide, but they're spread thin. And that creates its own challenges and so forth. I just thought that was a really interesting way of looking at the diaspora in the American Southwest. And then just one last comment, and then I'll shut up. It's a good thing there's a mute function on Zoom, because otherwise you would hear and have heard my cat babbling in the background through the whole presentation. So
there you have it. You know, and we think, but you know, so Mordecai Kaplan, Rabbi Cohen reminded us of this over the high holidays, right? Mordecai Kaplan said that there are three essential aspects to being Jewish. There is behaving, belonging, and believing. And behaving is doing, how do we be Jews? We're Jews partly by the ways we behave Jewishly. And so Max Frankel, alav shalom, at the Temple Emmanuel here in Denver, used to say, if you were accused of being Jewish, would there be enough evidence in your life to convict you, right? So if someone looks at you, would they be able to know that you are Jewish because you do Jewish things? There's the belonging piece, right? Which is, you know, the joke when you talk about, you know, why do you go to synagogue? Don't believe in God. Why do you go to synagogue? He says, well, you know, my friend Mira goes to synagogue to talk to God, and I go to synagogue to talk to Mira, right? That's the belonging aspect. We create community by showing up with each other week after week or month after month, right? We create community by doing things together. And in Jewish thought, believing is the least, in some ways, the least important. You can believe a lot of weird things and still be in the Jewish community. But these other things are the ways we kind of show up for each other. Anyone else? Comments? Arguments? Anybody gonna throw tomatoes at me? You know, I'm open.
I can't tell, John, do you have your hand up again? John?
No, it should be down.
Oh, okay, okay.
I didn't know.
I love how these.
well, thank you. Shabbat shalom. Too.
Shabbat shalom. Everybody have a sweet Shabbat.
Shabbat shalom.
About to gain an hour of sleep, so that is really nice. You know. So yes, I wish you all a sweet Shabbat and a good week ahead. Thank you for having me.
Rabbi, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Thank you all for coming.